Hi, my name is Charles Fox, and this is my undergraduate thesis presentation titled Pursuit, a Collaging of Critical Art and Graphic Design. Here is a short outline of my presentation that will serve as a through line and a guide through my project, and we'll start at the beginning with my investigation and inspiration early in my thesis process. At the start of my thesis investigation, I was interested in graphic design and typography, especially in their relationship to political and protest art. I was doing these type exercises and even experimenting with virtual reality to explore how activism might move forward in the digital age. However, early in this process, I was hitting a creative wall in the direction I was going. I didn't need to start over, but rather reorient my project towards subjects and mediums of art that I enjoy and thought were valuable. Considering this, I reconnected with my first love of art, which was graffiti and street art. This interest got me arrested when I was very young, but I was fortunate enough to join a street art group in high school in my home in Hawaii and do some murals at my school. I was happy to be able to channel this passion because my love for it never really left. Graffiti is not regulated to the borders of a page, and public space is the stage. It's unconstrained, and it's expected to be aggressive, provocative, and boastful. Most importantly, you can completely reinvent yourself, designing a new name and self-image as an aesthetic project. I found that street art held a position between two seemingly opposing creative systems, graphic design and critical art. The goal of a graffiti artist and graphic artist are very similar to me, to be recognizable and reach as many people as possible, and similar tactics are employed. Scale, repetition through visual and typographic consistency, humor and irony, originality and cleverly taking advantage of space and materials, and lastly, subversion. Street art and graphic art have the unique capability to subvert political authority and speak truth to power, often using satire to raise the consciousness of spectators. These works are often antagonistic to large corporations and toy with images of mass culture. Like critical art, they can concisely and cleverly illustrate mechanisms of domination and laws of exploitation. Making these comparisons and connections between my two interests in graphic design and street art helped me move into the next section of my thesis project, which would be the criteria or my verbal guide. I wanted to find a subject where I could blend and juxtapose the functionality of graphic design and the evocative impact of critical art and graffiti. I needed to give this subject some criteria. It had to need a realignment of its values, a kind of rebranding. It also had to be deeply polarized so that there could be some unification, and it had to have some urgent issues, historical ones that ripple in the present and modern ones that will determine our future. It was clear that the subject that checked all these boxes was the United States. With polarization, factionalism, and hyperbolic talk driving us apart, it's in dire need of a unifying message, but one that does not overlook its many shortcomings. A message that shows capital behind objects and behaviors, and exposes hypocrisy between a displayed message and the incongruous reality of its implementation and enforcement. Art and design have a unique way of showing harsh realities while remaining hopeful and beautiful. However, there's no possible way I could address every issue and create a message and visual identity that connects and resonates with everyone unanimously, and I wouldn't even want to try that. So how could I distill my project and process it into something manageable but still powerful? My first thought was, what messaging does the US already have? The ever-repeated phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. An updated phrase by Thomas Jefferson from John Locke's Life, Liberty, and Property. Pursuit stood out first as an interesting double entendre, a positive, self-driven attitude and a more negative predator versus prey dynamic, and its Latin origins pro or per sequi also being the roots of the words persecute, prosecute, and persuade. Happiness also stood out as feeling a bit abstract. You know when you don't have it, but you're not always conscious of it when you're feeling it. Also, different groups have different happiness, and these opposing factions will sometimes work against public interest and the rights of others to secure their happiness. Something I think we pursue a lot more than happiness is love, both romantically and socially, from partners, peers, friends, colleagues, mentors, teachers, bosses, social and political groups. It's more communal, and I also like the alliteration of life, liberty, and love. The next section of my thesis is my typeface, or my visual guide. From my criteria, I had some messaging, and thinking of a visual representation of these words led me to designing my own typeface that would serve as a jumping off point of my project. I started by sketching and investigating fonts that felt representative of the United States. I initially considered Blackletter or Old English. However, it felt a little overused, as it was identifiable with countless other movements, from religion and tattooing to punk and rap, as well as journalism. I thought about type from 1950s advertising, as well as 1960s psychedelic rock and anti-war posters, but those fonts felt a little too flowing and free-spirited for what I wanted. Then I fell on 19th century wood type. These fonts were identifiable in newspapers, broadside posters, and Western bounty signs, and I loved the thick to thin slabby fonts with large boxy serifs on top and bottom. I was also intrigued that these typefaces represented a brutal time period in our history that is romanticized in mass culture through cowboys, rangers, horses, manifest destiny, and the American West. I was attracted to the potential irony of using an American wood type inspired font to be critical of the United States. Here is some early experimentation where I was still considering some hybrids of Blackletter and some hints of American wood type. Through further investigation, I wanted to modernize my typeface and bring it into an era dominated by technology. After all, I was creating it with a computer and not hand-cutting the letters. I came up with a systematic approach and decided on 3 modular forms that would make up the different stroke weights of my font. And here's a quick time lapse of me building, I think, a W. And here's the typeface I produced. It's an all-caps display font inspired by 19th century wood type. However, its rigid and compact nature is also reminiscent of the digital age and strikes a balance between vintage and modern aesthetics. In designing this poster on the left that illustrates the logic of the modular forms, I also used them in the poster as a grid system. Now I'll move to the next section, which is mapping. I wanted to make some pieces using the messaging I had outlined in my criteria and my newly created font, and so I looked back on some of the type experiments I did earlier in my process. I like the overlapping and compacting of letter forms, thereby extracting what are normally clarifying symbols. And from that line of inquiry, I thought about mapping and cartography. It's a form of abstracting reality for us to more easily move about physically. Using my font, I created this triptych of maps that document recent social and political issues. I'll go through each of them individually, but I first want to point out that each of them have one of those words, life, liberty, and love, laid into them, and also to consider how those words may be antithetical to the actions and developments the maps may represent. I also specifically chose issues that have recently seen some form of resolution or justice. They're certainly not done and over, but I think they can be cautionary and a reminder that action and persistence can produce results. This first map is of Flint, Michigan, emphasizing the Flint River which runs through the heart of the city. This was the source of Flint's water crisis where, in a money-saving move, an emergency manager appointed by then-Governor Rick Snyder authorized a project to switch the city's drinking water from Detroit system to the Flint River. As we know, the inadequate treatment and testing of the water resulted in a major health crisis that led to the sickness and death of Flint residents. In January of just this year, the Michigan Attorney General's office announced criminal charges for 9 former and current state officials, including former Governor Rick Snyder, for their role in constructing and then neglecting and underplaying the situation. The group faces 42 charges from perjury to involuntary manslaughter. And here's a detail of that piece. This next map shows the current and proposed extension of the Keystone XL pipeline. Introduced by energy infrastructure company TC Energy, the pipeline would transport 830,000 barrels of carbon-intensive crude from Alberta to various processing hubs and refineries on the Gulf Coast of Texas. On his first day in office, President Biden canceled the developer's cross-border permit as a part of his climate action plan. The equally controversial Dakota Access Pipeline, which would run under the Missouri River, still remains in question. Amid pressure from indigenous leaders and environmentalists, Biden's administration has said it will review the operation after the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers completes an environmental impact statement. This last map depicts Pennsylvania's 7th Congressional District from 2011 to 2018. Following the 2010 national census and state elections, the state's political leadership redrew its congressional district map and, like many other states, without an independent or bipartisan commission. After a lawsuit in 2017, Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled the map constituted an illegal partisan gerrymander, citing District 7 as the most egregious example, considering it overlapped sections of 5 different counties. With partisanship on the rise and a priority on winning over the will of the people, similar situations seem likely with the rollout of the 2020 national census. And those are the maps. I was happy with how they turned out and their intersections of type design and criticism. However, they felt like a structured and formulated project. And for the next section of my thesis, I wanted to use my typeface in a more expressive way that felt more like an art piece. Playwright Bertolt Brecht has a famous quote about all forms of art that goes, "Less than ever does the mere reflection of reality reveal anything about reality." And I think the functionality of these maps felt a little too close to reality. And that leads into the final section of my project, collage, which I've subtitled Amalgamation, as it is a meeting ground for many mediums, subjects, and ideas. Combining paintings, illustrations, abstract forms, photographs, headlines, and type is a pure divergence of mediums that can show an aesthetic compatibility between worlds. In critical art, collage utilizes everyday objects but can go against their logic to show a hidden link between them. This can be seen in the anti-Nazi photo montages of John Hartfield, showing Hitler's reliance on Germany's wealthy industrialists, or Martha Rosler, who united the industries of war and consumerism by mixing photos from the Vietnam War with advertisements from American home decor magazines. Photocopied punk fanzines from the 1980s and 90s used collage to create an aesthetic that was opposed to societal norms. These zines were innovative in employing text and image to create an effect rather than communicate information. And on the right, contemporary artist Tristan Eaton, whose series Uprise displays the deadly and militaristic response to major protests. Here we see his representations of the Rodney King riots and the Tiananmen Square protests. The layering of collage can reveal one world hidden beneath another. Capitalist violence behind happiness of consumption, market interest superseding class struggle, and personal advancement over community organizing. And these can be masked even further by the apparent serenity of art. With that, I set out to make another triptych of collages to correspond with the maps I made earlier. I'm still completing the last piece, but I'll go in depth on the 2 completed ones. My goal with these was to react to some contemporary issues and explore my relationship to them, while also letting my influences of graphic design and graffiti from the investigations I did earlier to show through, and additionally incorporating my typeface into each design with the words life, liberty, and love. With this first piece, I wanted to reference the overall onslaught of social media, both in the amount of content we consume, and that for these social media companies, we are just a data set that can be sold to advertisers. The checker pattern I used are images from my Instagram Explore page, and I hate to admit it, but they give a pretty accurate picture of who I am and what I like. Additionally, animals are cultural identifiers and can serve as metaphors for several different things. Here I chose the bull and the bear for their relation to market interests, as well as the bear as a symbol for Russian nationalism, a country which has become synonymous with disinformation spread on social media. Just prior to making this piece, I had been reading a story about how Russia had been spreading anti-fracking content in order to maintain reliance on Russian gas. And it was just a further example of how weird and complex the social media space has become as a home for politics and shopping, humor and hatred, as well as activism and self-definement. I want to leave these up for some interpretation, but I will say in this next piece I was exploring metaphors and symbols of consumerism and control, one of which was horses. They hold a lot of meaning, and our relationship to them is fascinating but also unusual to me. They're naturally wild and free-spirited animals, but we've benefited from taming and commanding. They used to be of immense economic value in transportation and agriculture, to name some examples. However, I think we often mistake a connection to nature with an ability to control it. In the bottom right, I've depicted some British fox hunters, a not-so-subtle signal of how we've taken nature and turned it against itself for our own pleasure and sport. In this process shot, I just wanted to show that I'm still using the modular forms from my typeface as a grid for these pieces as well. And here's the sketch for my final piece. I haven't teased out all the ideas yet, but I know I wanted to deal with journalism and growing distrust in news. With the rise and popularity of QAnon conspiracies and events such as the Jamal Khashoggi murder and subsequent cover-up by the Saudi government, it's a critical and time-sensitive issue for our country moving forward. I wanted to show these pieces as diptychs as well for comparison and as a through line of my project. I especially love making these collages and constructing the collisions and juxtapositions between diverse elements to create striking and shocking effects. Unlike more formal graphic design, the structure isn't governed by a hierarchy of forms. Elements are placed side by side as equal parts of a whole to make the most evocative impact, and its purpose is to create a feeling or effect rather than provide detailed information. I also loved exploring the tabloid-like sensibilities and expressive qualities of type. Some type grabs your attention, others convey emotions and identities, and sometimes it's just purely functional. It's truly a psychological art form. Lastly, I enjoyed exploring what felt like a lot, but is truly very few issues we face in our current society. However, educating and growing, both creatively and intellectually, is all we can ask of ourselves. And through this project, I believe I found several techniques and inspirations I can carry into future work. Thank you for listening.